All right. So, dear Francisco, dear Urs, thank you. It's an honor to be here in front of this crowd. I realize that my bio is a bit outdated, so I need to maybe rewrite my bio. It's maybe something we wrote like 5 years ago. Dear INSEAD grad of 23D, congratulations. I'm sure you worked hard, you played hard. I hope it was the year of your life at INSEAD. You must be a bit sad, leaving INSEAD, leaving the cocoon now, but congratulations, you made it. So as I was reflecting on what to say today, I was reflecting back on what was in the air when I was at INSEAD in 2006, 2007. What were the trends back then? And at the time, Friedman had just published his book, The World is Flat, explaining how innovation would essentially make like a level playing field for companies in the world to expand their, to optimize their supply chain, to recruit. And essentially it was the era of globalization. So it was one of the big themes when we were at INSEAD. Another force or theme during that time was technology. But it was more diffuse at the time, right? You have to remember that in 2006, 2007, we had Nokia phones, the iPhone was not out, there was MySpace and this new thing called Facebook, where we could connect only with an INSEAD email address. But it was there. It was kind of in the air that technology was part of the equation and what we would need to deal with in the future. And last but not least, it was the time when Al Gore released his movie, The Inconvenient Truth, which was, maybe most of you have seen it, which was an eye-opening prophecy on climate change and the fact that we had to act on climate change. But it was also like a very hopeful message for companies to say, now is the time to get involved. Not just because you have a problem to fix, but because it's a good time to get involved. And the next decade will be the decade of companies building toward a greener economy. So when we sit here today, what, like 17 years or so later, it's pretty clear that one of these two trends over-delivered, and that's technology, right? So if we think of technology and internet and software in the cloud, it has changed the way we work, the way we deliver education, the way we interact socially, the way we consume media, and so on and so on. And you know that, like we live in that world of technology. And to give you, I wrote down a few numbers to show like the incredible value creation actually that happened around technology during that time. So Apple, when I joined INSEAD, was worth $50 billion. Now it's worth $3 trillion. Google was worth $100 billion. Now it's $1.6 trillion. Amazon was 20, now it's 1.5. Salesforce was 7, now it's 250, and so on and so on and so on. Netflix was 1, now it's 200. So back in September 2006, an MBA was a good investment, but buying shares in Amazon would have been not too bad either, right? I've done the MBA, so that was my choice back then. It was a good choice, I guess, and it's hard to predict the future. Now, in contrast, if you look at the shift to a greener economy, it's been very disappointing, right? And the promise that it will be a fantastic decade for companies to engage into shifting to a greener economy just did not materialize. Yet, the problem that was highlighted was real, right? If you look at CO2 emission between 2007 and 2020, it has increased by about 20–25%, depending on where you look. And yet, so I had this other number on the S&P Global Clean Energy Index, which I discovered essentially preparing these notes, it lost 2/3 of its value between 2007 and 2020. So playing toward a greener economy for businesses did not pay off, essentially, in the last 17 years. Now, the story of BlaBlaCar very much echoes that dual reality. So I came to INSEAD as an engineer by background, and I had spent 7 years in technology in Silicon Valley. So for me, I was a fierce believer that technology would play a role and that internet would continue to expand and it would be part of our life and it would change things. And when we started BlaBlaCar with my co-founder, Fred, who was also at INSEAD back then, so we literally wrote the first business plan of BlaBlaCar and the first pitch and the first presentation here in Fonty. Our observation, or the way we looked at it was the car is fundamentally misused. I mean, if you think of a car, it's sitting around doing nothing 98 or 99% of the time, And even when we use a car, it's a bit absurd because the car is mostly empty, right? So on short distance trips, it's 1.2 people per car. On longer distance trips, it's 1.6 people per car. So from an environmental standpoint, it felt like an absurdity, right? We had to fix that essentially. And even economically, it doesn't make sense. Like you carry all these empty seats which have commercial value. I mean, people pay for seats in trains and planes and buses and even cars. And we thought back then that internet would enable to fix that problem by creating communities and connecting people. And we still believe that today, by the way. Now, in the early days, it was not an obvious thing. And the first time we pitched BlaBlaCar, literally, was around here, in Fonty, in front of a group of business angels. So we came there essentially to win a prize and ask for money. And the reaction back then was, you guys are doing like hitchhiking online, right? And we were like, no. We're building this community and with internet, this like trusted thing, and people are going to connect. And people were like, yeah. So you're building hitchhiking online with Facebook. And if you get 100,000 people to use your thing, it's a miracle. And today, we have close to 100 million people signed up on the platform. So it's interesting to see how in 17 years, you can be wrong by a factor of 1,000, right, between like what was like a miracle and where we get to. And it speaks to the strength of that trend I was talking about on technology and internet and connecting people over that period of time. So yet the beginning of BlaBlaCar was pretty rough. Like no one believed in it, no one wanted to finance it, and it was a bit of a side project for many years with no employees. And during that time, as Urs was saying, I went and worked in a venture capital firm in London, and I was going back to Silicon Valley pretty often, like every quarter or so I was going back to Silicon Valley. And specifically, I was connecting with a friend, actually my ski pal in Silicon Valley, who happened to start a career as a venture capitalist at Bessemer Partners. And whenever I had the chance, I was pitching BlaBlaCar. I was saying like, well, look, the numbers, it's going up. I have a few people who used it, and it feels like it's going to be a big thing, and da-da-da-da-da. And I was doing that on a pretty frequent basis. And the idea grew on him over time. And as an investor in LinkedIn, that sort of got the story that over time we would be able to create these communities. He tried to invest back in late 2010, didn't work out. It was a bit too far for them to invest in France from California at the time. It was post-financial crisis, so it was not like an obvious time to invest in startup. And then in 2011, almost by luck, like he left his firm and he went to London to work for Accel Partners, which was a pretty famous venture capital firm who backed Facebook, Dropbox, Spotify, and pretty well known in the Valley. And he moved to an office in London that was on 16 St. James Street, 5th floor. And my office in London was 16 St. James Street, 4th floor. So my level of pitching went from quarterly to every day to just harassing Accel Partners about like any KPI moving up and to the right for BlaBlaCar. So eventually it paid off, and to be honest, he believed in it. He had to convince the partnership to invest back then. And we received, so it was in Jan 2012, and I was at the hospital. I remember that actually becoming a dad, and all of that happened like the same week, essentially. And we raised $10 million. And the announcement on TechCrunch, I have it here, read, Accel leads $10 million round in European Airbnb for car. And that was a big change, because suddenly we had Accel believing in the hitchhiking online company, and more importantly, it was not hitchhiking online anymore. Suddenly we had a frame of reference, I think that's what I've learned in marketing, and it was the sharing economy. And suddenly we were part of this big thing that would revolutionize the way we consume. And that was a big change. And suddenly, like, we became a hot company. And I was not chasing investors anymore. Investors were chasing me, essentially, to invest in the company. So we spent the next, essentially, 4 or 5 years growing like crazy, hiring people, launching market, doing fundraising, building the culture of the company, being a very global culture. And I used our network a lot, essentially, during that time. I mean, I launched Brazil with my housemate from INSEAD. I launched India with a classmate. Hired like a bunch of people from INSEAD to do all the M&A that Urs was talking about. And frankly, I realized during that scaling time and beyond the power of INSEAD. Like it was easy or easier to launch many markets at the same time and to hire like incredible talents thanks to us, thanks to the phenomenal network that we have. So those were happy days of growth, and I remember like investors chasing us pretty much everywhere, which for me was again like a big change. And I remember like when we became a unicorn. So it was funny because I had Insight Partners, one of the top VC firm in New York, like chasing me wherever I was going at conferences and so on to be able to invest. And one day, they felt we were sleeping away. And he called me, and I was in San Francisco, and he said, like, well, Nico, where are you? Where are you? And I was like, I'm in the Bay Area, just driving around, and I'm by that street called Sand Hill Road. And for those who know Silicon Valley, Sand Hill Road is code name for venture capital firms. That's where you have like all the VC firms. And then he was like, I'm there too. Like, let's have dinner tomorrow. And we went for dinner the next day, and they arrived with a signed term sheet with a billion valuation essentially on the table. And I had to stay composed and remember like my negotiation class. Inside I was like, yeah. And I was like, is that in dollar or euro? And we ended up negotiating a bit, and we landed with that investment. So those were, again, the happy days and the high growth of the company. And we believed sky was the limit, essentially. There was no end to how far we could grow. Obviously, it was not true. And soon enough, around 2016, so after 4 years of hypergrowth and fundraising, we started to get to some growth pains. And growth pains, essentially, for us meant, essentially, we had launched too many markets too fast. Some were working, some were not working. We had to do some triage. But more fundamentally, and what I want to share here, our leadership model was not working anymore, right? So we had built the entire company around the 3 founders with 3 different silos going as fast as we can and coordinating very efficiently between the 3 of us. But there was no exec team, essentially. That was just us running the shop as 3 silos. And when comes a time when you need to make hard decisions and you need to make choices, we realized that that model didn't work anymore. And we had to change to a more classic or normal model where you have a single CEO, an exec layer. And you have to understand that it's very hard to do that when you've put everything into that company and that group. So the founders are your friends. I mean, you spent more times with that group in the last 10 years than anyone in your life. The company is your net worth. It's your sense of identity because people see you as the BlaBlaCar guys. And the moment you try to make fast decisions for the company and change the leadership model is a very tough time. So for me, it was probably in the whole story of BlaBlaCar my toughest year to go through and manage all these changes. And what I've learned or discovered at that time is that you need to pace yourself. Like you cannot rush and run through everything. And you probably feel like that right now because you've done like a 1-year MBA and you rush through your MBA and you rush through your application and you rush through pretty much everything in life. And there is a point you realize, and maybe you have already, that you cannot rush through everything and it's going to take time. And you need to develop stamina and essentially solve the problems one by one. I also discovered coaching during that time, which I didn't know about and I never used before. So I had coaching for myself, I had coaching for the founding team, I had coaching for the exec. We even, later that, sent part of the team to John Piero for some sort of coaching, I would say. And it was the time where I realized that mental health of your team was critical, and for you as leaders in the future, it is going to be critical. So you should maybe think of that sooner than later in your career. So anyway, so I went through the motion, became CEO of the company around that time, which was again like a tough time to take leadership. Managed to sort of like fix the problems, and in 2018, the company was break even. We had a new strategy that we started to execute in 2019 by acquiring some companies, and the company was back in growth mode. And at that time, I thought, all right, I've done the hard part in a way, and now it should be smooth sailing toward whatever, like an IPO or whatever startup dream about. Little did I know, because in March 2020, the business stopped because of COVID. So it was like a massive stop, essentially, in the business that was totally surreal. And we had spent, essentially, 15 years or 12 years at that time telling people to share their car, to touch each other, to talk, and the government was saying, like, don't talk, don't be close to each other, don't step in a stranger's car, that's horrible, you're gonna die. So that was a rough moment, but interestingly for me, in terms of crisis management, it was a fairly easy time, in a sense that, as an optimist, I was convinced things would bounce back, and I saw that as an opportunity to get ahead. So essentially what we decided to do, because we entered the crisis with cash, so we had more than 100 million euro actually on the balance sheet at the beginning of the crisis. I thought, I'm not going to lay off anyone, I'm going to keep the team, and not only that, I'm going to get the engineers and the product folks to work full time. And at that time, what most companies were doing, I mean, those impacted obviously by COVID. If you zoom, it was happy days, I guess. But for BlaBlaCar, it was not happy days. So we get the engineers to work full time just to get ahead, develop the product, and essentially outcompete some of our competitors back then. And it was a big bet, essentially, because the burn rate of the company in 2020 was roughly 50 million. So we were burning 50 million per year. So we had something like 2.5 years probably in front of us, but not more, right? So COVID had to disappear. And initially in 2020, I was very convinced that it would just go away. And then when it went into like ups and down, I was, I was getting a bit edgy on like when is the end of the tunnel. Now, luckily in 2022, it was sort of the end of the restrictions, and all these bets clearly paid off. Like the product was much better. We were clearly ahead of competitors at that time, and the business bounced back beautifully in 2022 and 2023 and turned profitable, right? Which is where you want to get to as a VC-backed startup. At some point in time, you need to be a self-sustaining company. So it worked out. It was not quite the end of crisis because like the team felt like we had seen any crisis you can possibly see at BlaBlaCar. But we had to face yet another crisis I'll mention quickly, but it's pretty important, and one you probably don't want to see any time in your business life: war. War because we had expanded in Russia and Ukraine as part of like the many countries where we expanded the service. And in 2022, while interestingly the business was doing fantastic, we had like a major sort of value issue and team issue, and we had to take care of a Ukrainian team and make sure they were safe. And we also had to sort of separate the Russian business and separate the teams that were reporting to each other back then. So it was a very hard moment for all of us, essentially, and yet another crisis that you need to overcome as a leader. But it was also very interesting to see what BlaBlaCar can bring to the world. Because what happened during the beginning, especially of the war in Ukraine, many people had to flee, essentially, from the east side of the country to the west side of the country. And the entire transport network was destroyed, essentially. I mean, not destroyed, but there were missing drivers, and it was very impossible to move across the country. And within a very short period of time, we've seen, which was very, very interesting, we've seen like a spike of activity in Ukraine, bigger than ever, because there was this massive wave of solidarity where drivers were publishing their ride on BlaBlaCar and helping people essentially move west and move to Poland. And we've seen many people from Poland crossing the border, picking up passengers, refugees, if you like, from Ukraine and moving west. And that was like a very strong moment for the company and for especially the people in Ukraine, because we had a purpose. Like suddenly, like the product was actually doing something good and was a solution to the problem we were facing. So you might wonder why I'm focusing on all these sort of up and downs of the business life, and clearly it's not to discourage you to become entrepreneurs, even though it's a rough road. The reason I'm focusing on this crisis and these ups and downs, it's because you learn a lot more during these downturns and these crises than during the sort of upturn and when things go well. And that's when you need to make hard decisions. That's when your team will require you to make hard decisions. That's also when your team and your your stakeholders might not understand your decision. That's when you'll feel probably alone, essentially during this period of time where you need to make those hard choices. So what I've learned from that and what I wanted to pass along is, number one, you are more susceptible to externalities than you think. And that's one thing we discovered, from like the big internet trend to the war in Ukraine to the COVID crisis. And when things go well, stay humble, stay connected, right? Because it might not just be you, actually. It might be a big trend like pushing you up. And when things go down, you need to have stamina, and that's when you'll be a real leader, and you'll need to make hard decisions. And that's when you know what wood you're made of, essentially. So another thing, actually, that I learned during that time, and that I would like to pass along, I guess, to future entrepreneurs in the room, the reason I'm still here today, essentially, and BlaBlaCar is still alive, is because we respected, or we understood, like, the rule number one of a startup, which is never run out of cash, right? So it's as basic as that, essentially. So we managed to survive this crisis because we raised money when we could, not when it was like running out of cash on the balance sheet. And frankly, again, the company could have been bust 2 or 3 times if we had not raised enough money at the right time. And it's amazing to see, as like, when I was a VC or an angel investor, how many companies and founders end up with zero just because they're run out of cash at the wrong time. So think of these externalities and what they could bring as positive and negative. And last but not least, pace yourself, right? So you need to go through very long journeys and crises, and you cannot sprint through everything. So you need to take care of yourself. And again, like I discovered like mental health and having like a coach and so on makes a huge difference for you, for your team, your exec team, your partners, and it will be a great help, I guess, in your business life. So where does that leave us, and where does that leave you now in 23? So I believe today we are at the crossroad of technology and the shift to a greener economy in terms of big trends. And the shift to a greener economy had a false start, as you can see, in 2006, 2007. But when you look at today and how, to some extent, like science and politics and consumer behavior and company responsibility is somewhat converging, it feels that trend is more rooted today than it's ever been. And today, like, you should engage into a shift to a greener economy. I think now it is indeed a good time and a good idea for businesses to get involved. And that's something, interestingly, that we see at BlaBlaCar, right? So going back to my only vantage point or point of observation, if you look at the last 15 years, BlaBlaCar grew mostly from the rise of internet and marketplaces. And we had a bit of a cherry on the cake, which was saving the planet, essentially. But it was not an investment case. In most of the time, it was not a business model. Now, if I look at the next 10 years, the need to decarbonize transport is becoming like a much more important theme, and it really becomes a business model. So to give you a sense of like what it means very quickly for BlaBlaCar, in France, for example, short-distance carpooling is now recognized as public transport. So suddenly we can get revenue stream from the region, which is additional to what we do. Now we see many countries setting up carbon credit scheme or energy certificate schemes that we can resell in more and more regions. So suddenly you generate value through your activity. Those schemes did not exist like 15 years ago. And the value of these certificates is going up. So suddenly it is a business model, and I do see that the next generation of investors looking at BlaBlaCar are looking at that angle a lot more. So if I were to summarize like where I think you should be, or where I would be, or where I am actually, both with BlaBlaCar and as an angel, I think you probably need to find yourself at the crossroad of technology and the shift to a greener economy in some ways. And when I remember what a venture capitalist called Vinod Khosla in the Valley once told me. He said, when you look at the scale of the problem of climate change, if you do something that doesn't scale, it doesn't matter. And to some extent, I think that's what businesses should try to bring to the equation, like scalable solution, combining technology and the shift to a greener economy. And I think that's going to be a sweet spot for the next 10 years for businesses, for investment, for startups, and you see much more funding essentially going into that. So I think, it's the real start of a shift to a greener economy, and I believe you should engage. Now, and to conclude, the world you'll be operating in will have its challenges. I mean, clearly the world is not flat anymore, and we've seen that, with all the crises from COVID to political tension to outright war, countries are thinking more and more inwards, and we live in a world of multipolarity or potential deglobalization. Now, INSEAD was precisely built with the mission to create international stability through shared economic interests that go beyond politics by training multicultural leaders like you. So I think if there is a group of people that has the cards to navigate the new context, the new deglobalization or changing context in the world, that's probably you. And not you individually, you as an INSEAD group with all your friendship and your connection, you probably have the key essentially to solve some of the big problems. So now it's time to get out of the chateau or the cocoon or wherever you are today and be a force for good. Thank you.